Hello and welcome to the Rask Network. What you're about to hear and see is limited to general financial information only. Please be sure to speak to your financial planner or refer to our financial services guide available at rask.com.au/FSG before acting on the information. Pete Wargent, welcome to this Australian property podcast episode, mate.
Owen Rask, good to see you. I've got to see you've got the festive gear on. Good to see.
I've only got a very small amount compared to yourself. For anyone that's watching on video, you can see Pete has his Santa hat and a Santa top, where I've just got the hat. How you going, mate?
Yeah, pretty good. I was actually bought this by my kids, so I've got to try and get as much use as I can over the festive season. But yeah, no, pretty good. All good here. We're just starting to. Well, the time of recording, we're just winding down for Christmas. It'll probably be after Christmas by the time you hear this. But yeah, it's all been pretty good. Been a very busy second half of the year, 2023, and been very busy on the podcast as well, which has been great.
Yeah, I know you were just saying off air that your buyer's agency stuff is really, really busy.
Flat out.
Flat out, yeah. And obviously you're doing the coaching as well, which is ramping up as well. So I can imagine how busy you are. And I think that I could be wrong. I'm not a tax agent. Maybe you are. And you can say, if you wear a Santa hat on a podcast that maybe you get paid for, not saying that you do, but like, you know, you get clients and stuff from this, does it become tax deductible?
Well, wasn't there this thing, like if you wear something specifically, clothing or accessories specifically for work, so if you wear sunglasses and you're a policeman, you know, maybe that becomes deductible. I think Father Christmas hats or Santa hats might be stretching the boundaries a little bit. Yeah. So I'm very on the side of caution with that one, I think.
Yeah, don't take your Christmas gear as tax deductible based on what you hear. So this episode we're talking about a bit of a review of 2023. So we started the Australian Property Podcast on the 28th of March 2023. Already the podcast has been downloaded hundreds of thousands of times, which is just incredible. So thank you to everyone who has subscribed and everyone who leaves us feedback or asks questions. It's been heaps of fun. It's been so much fun. And just working with the three brilliant property thinkers over here, Pete, Chris, and Amy, it's been a real pleasure for me. We now are getting around about 25,000 unique listeners, and it's just consistently growing, Pete. So that's great. You and I went on the road a lot this year. Chris came, Amy came to Sydney. We had over 1,000 people come to the events this year, which is just unbelievable. Maybe, and I don't know, how is because you're a property coach, you work with people in group settings, one-on-one. You've obviously got the buyer's agency based out of Brizzy. But how have you found, I guess, speaking with people that come through the podcast, Pete?
Yeah, good. So the first half of the year was somewhat slow anyway, because if you remember, we were at the early stages of the interest rate hiking cycle. There's a lot of uncertainty about how far interest rates might go and how high they might go. Then we kicked off the podcast, I guess, at the end of Q1, thereabouts, I think, as you said. And yeah, we've been out on the road. We went out to Wang, which was fantastic. Wangaratta. Yep. Port Macquarie. Where else did we go? Newcastle, Sydney. Yeah, we've been all around the place, and I think that's been fantastic too. You can't really beat a bit of face-to-face interaction once a year. That's really good. Yeah, and yeah, we just get so many people contacting and saying, "Oh, I've been listening a lot to the episodes on the podcast, and it's a really good means of connection." So yeah, and we've got steadily busier as the year's gone on. I think for a couple of reasons. One, because more listeners on the podcast, and also I think people are starting to get more confidence about where interest rates are going to finish up, and I guess the fundamentals of the property market. And yeah, as you said, picking up quite a few coaching clients as well. I think mainly thanks to you and your podcast. So it's been a really good year. And yeah, I think at the start of the year, there was lots of uncertainty and all the sort of doom and gloom about, you know, the US will be in recession, Australia will follow. And a lot of that stuff just hasn't really played out as expected. You know, we often say Australia is a lucky country, but it does seem to be sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to be able to jump on every week to listen to you and Chris on a Sunday morning, and just get some common sense, I guess, long-term thinking, because a lot of what we hear in the news about property is just always like myopic, the most sensationalist headlines we can find, and it's been a really bizarre and intriguing year, which we'll cover in just a moment. But this year, just to recap what else happened behind the scenes, Amy launched her new course. And by the way, there's a free resource from Amy, which has been downloaded, I think, a few hundred times, which is her 100-point checklist for when you're buying a property. So that's available in every episode that we produce. So every episode that we produce, there's links to Pete's coaching, buyer's agency, there's Amy's checklist, there's the other RAS stuff like free courses. There's also the mortgage broking joint venture between Blusk, which is Chris's business, and Rask. We've had 180 or thereabouts at the time of recording, 180 folks go through and start that process, which is just awesome. And so we've had a big year, not just in the industry, but also for the podcast. The 3 most popular episodes of the podcast this year were Amy's 25K renovation episode. So it's where she talked about how she did some renos. Obviously, bit of a title there, 25K renovation. If you can pull one of those off, good for you. But she did talk about how you can, do some pretty basic things to improve the face value of your property. There was an episode on tax and property that I believe Chris conducted, or maybe it was you in there too, Pete. And then there was building and renovating for profit with Rebeka from Build Her. So really good episodes. They're all available in your podcast feed if you're interested in those. Now, Pete, recently, like you said, as we were coming off the back of 2022, it was pretty scary for a lot of people. Interest rates had just started rising in mid-2022. We got up to around about 3% here in Australia at the end of 2022. And at that time, there were calls like for property prices to fall 20, 30%. And this is what people were getting fed by the news each and every day. I guess now that we have some data, are you surprised about that, that we've, where we've ended up?
I didn't think we'd get 20 or 30% downturn, but actually the market has been definitely stronger, I think, than almost anyone would have predicted, given the trajectory of interest rates. I think, and when you look at the reasons for why, I mean, it sounds a bit trite, but it always comes down to supply and demand in the old cliche. And I think, building slowed, construction slowed right down. We've got a lot of construction insolvencies. Most people decided not to sell. I think a lot of people through the COVID pandemic period had built up huge savings buffers. So most people just decided to hang on. But then population growth absolutely soared back, and the rental vacancies fell to the lowest level on record. So renting wasn't a great place to be either. And then things just bottomed out. And then once the market started rebounding, then confidence just built from there. So yeah, absolutely. I didn't think we'd ever get a sort of doomsday scenario. I think some of those were a bit far-fetched, but certainly I don't think anyone would have expected 2023 to be quite as positive a year as it was, given what happened to interest rates.
Yeah, it's so simple that you would think that, the borrowing costs for people go so far up that then prices should come down due to the nature of leverage in our property market. I won't stick the boot in too much, but I pulled this quote from Chris Joy, who's a pretty widely read person in the AFR. And the quote is, "New research shows that house prices could fall more than 30% if the Reserve Bank of Australia meets the market's interest rate expectations." That was from June 2022. And we did see a little bit of a blip, but it was, when I say it's a blip, at the time it would have felt pretty scary. But we didn't quite see that. And if we go over the full year, Pete, we've had things like, the Ukraine war continuing. We've had more recently the kind of conflict breakout between Israel and Gaza, Hamas, I should say. We've had those interest rates continue to go higher. We've had that rental squeeze. We've had borrowing costs obviously just skyrocket. We've had the quote-unquote mortgage prisoners. We've had the US shooting down a Chinese spy balloon. We've had uncertainty with the US elections. Like Victoria, just the budget in the state of Victoria just blowing out. Like all of these things that are just such scary headlines for so many people to deal with. But through it all, property prices have actually risen across the country in 2023. That's using data from CoreLogic to the end of November. Like that, I feel like that's just, I don't think anyone could have predicted that at the beginning of the year.
Not given what's happened to inflation and interest rates. So I think the inflation story was an interesting one. I mean, we've been through an extraordinary few years. We've never really, you can't sort of back test this and say, oh, well, this is what happens when you shut the international borders, lock everyone down for months on end. In Victoria, months and months on end. And there's nothing really, there's no precedent for us to sort of test against. But obviously, it was going to create some supply chain issues. And I think there was a combination of a lot of people had cash buffers. So I think with fiscal policy, I mean, we've generally seen over the years, like in the global financial crisis, if you give people money, they'll generally spend it. So the spending side held up. But then globally, we just had these enormous supply chain issues. We had epic shortages of materials. If you went back 18 months ago, there was enormous skill shortages, particularly in hospitality and retail. There just wasn't enough people around to do that type of work. There was no students, the working holiday makers and backpackers weren't here. Just all kinds of issues. And inflation spikes, not just in Australia. We saw 11% in the UK, 9% in the US. Basically everywhere was grappling with the same issues. But then things started to turn around once the world opened up again and supply chains started righting themselves. And as we speak, I mean, Australia is a bit further behind on this journey, but the Eurozone has got inflation back to 2.4. The UK is under 4. US and Canada are back to 3. So I think there was a bit of, there's a lot of fear there for a time, because you always wonder, if that genie gets out of the bottle, can you get it back in? But confidence has resumed. So yeah, it's been an extraordinary 3 years in so many different ways, and hopefully not to be repeated anytime soon. But yeah, I mean, I was chatting to Michael Yardney the other day, and we were just reminiscing that actually at one stage people were talking about the US unemployment rate hitting 25% during the worst of the lockdowns, and here we are today at under 4. So yeah, I mean, there's been some challenges, no doubt, with the cost of living and various other challenges for business and so on. But all things considered, you'd be very happy with where things have ended up compared to how they might have been. Oh,
absolutely. I remember seeing photos where the cameraman and all of that would use those really long lenses to try and look at the lines for people lining up at the unemployment offices in the US and make it look like there's hundreds of people standing in a row when they're just all social distancing and physical distancing, and it wasn't as bad as it seems. But I remember that, and you would see that on the news, and even here in Australia, we had Job Seeker, Job Keeper, all of these things that were trying to stimulate this once in 100-year pandemic, and people were locked at home. And I think what we saw and what we've seen so far, if we kind of bring it up towards today's timeline, is that we saw over the COVID period a huge buffer built up by those households, as you say. And now we've seen the complete opposite of all of those savings be depleted to a point where those savings are now, household savings figures for Australia are around GFC levels in terms of how low they are. And so folks are now, this is maybe not a forecast, but I would suspect that we will start to see a bite from this in the next 3 to 6 months, and that really hit different parts of the economy in different ways. At least that's my kind of gut feel, Pete.
I think you're right. There's always a stock versus flow thing here. So the stock of savings might still be pretty high, but if you look at the saving ratio each quarter, well, it's now pretty much down to 0, and it was at 25%. So yes, people aren't saving anymore, but yeah, a lot of this stuff is driven at the margin, by certain households running down their cash, mortgage stress, that kind of thing. So it will start to show up, particularly in the retail turnover figures. And then if interest rates do end up staying higher for longer, eventually you'll start to see it in things like mortgage arrears as well. And so far, mortgage arrears have been pretty low. But it's been the retail sector that's starting to feel the pinch. So yeah, it's been a wild period, and but yes, higher in mortgage rates. We've had cost of living increase for things like energy and rents, and households have seen various points higher fuel prices and things like that. It's just it's reduced, even though incomes have gone up in nominal terms. The cost of living has gone up a lot more. And yes, the household saving ratio, I think we'll find for the December quarter, it'll be near enough nil. People aren't saving anymore on a net basis. And yes, that will start to slow down the economy in 2024. But that's exactly what the rate hikes were designed to do, to bring inflation back to target.
Yeah, well, it is. And it's interesting how there's been a few studies throughout the year about how higher interest rates may actually be, in some instances, may actually increase inflation, because people with assets and capital, they're earning more on their term deposits and the savings accounts, while the people in the mortgage belt, they're the ones typically younger, middle-aged people, are feeling the pinch the most. I think Alan Kohler came out during the year with kind of a bit of a viral show that he did on ABC, and showed that based on, I think it was Combank data, at different age groups, there was actually increased spending. And that was quite interesting. How about with your coaching clients, Pete? Are you seeing anything there? Are they generally optimistic? Are they consolidating? Are they buying more? Because I was chatting to some folks on the weekend, and they have investment properties, and I was thinking, maybe it's, that whole past performance is not an indicator of future performance. They're kind of like the trough of thinking, this is pretty bad. It's been pretty hard this year. And they're all thinking of offloading their properties because of things like increased property taxes in Victoria, these types of things, and just trying to find another option. Maybe it's the share market or something like that. How about with your clients? Is there kind of any trends or shifts or sentiment that you're feeling from them?
Yes. So, yes, as Mr. Kohler said, I think for mortgage-free people, retirees in particular, higher interest rates, if you're getting more returns from fixed interest, so things like term deposits or bonds, well, that's not a bad thing if you're in retirement. Yes, the cost of living's gone up as well for things like airfares and travel, maybe cruises, insurances, but it's not a bad thing necessarily for the retirees. But yes, it's a bit self-selecting, because most of my clients are either aspirational professionals or pre-retirees, and most of them have some debt. So it's definitely been a period of consolidation. Some people have decided to offload their worst performing or least preferred properties in their portfolio. And I think we're seeing that actually in some of the numbers. Actually, there's more investors leaving the market in 2023 for property than entering. And that's one of the things that's contributed to the rental crisis. But yes, as you said, the higher interest rates there, it can actually stoke inflation in some parts of the economy. Rents is one place where it's showing up. Also, there's a lot of stuff which is really driven by international trends like oil prices and things like that, which Australia, our interest rates aren't really going to have an impact there. So, I think it's been a year where definitely of caution. But overall, I think as the year's gone on, people have fared a whole lot better than might have been expected in January. So, there's a lot more confidence, I think, going into next year.
I think from the data that we're seeing, and what I'm hearing from Chris's team at Blusk, is that there's a lot of people lining up and looking at things like refinancing, seeing what equity they have in their home, seeing if they can improve their incomes to increase borrowing capacity. And they're kind of like in this almost like a holding pattern while they wait for that moment when interest rates do start to fall, their increased borrowing capacity comes back, and they'll look to expand either their portfolio, upgrade, etc. I've got to admit, that's something like on my mind in the next year or two, is how do we unlock some of the equity that we've got in our house for the last few years? How do we unlock that to then invest in another property, upgrade, etc., etc. And you were saying before we hit record that through the buyer's agency business, that a lot of that demand isn't being met with supply at the moment.
No, I think certainly for quality stock, I think there are listings on the market, but I think one of the reasons that buyers agents have been busy this year is that it's actually really difficult to get your hands on quality assets and quality stock, and people are struggling to find that type of thing, that property, the upgraders, or sometimes investors just can't find the properties they want. So they're outsourcing to a buyer's agent. And of course, the buyer's agents are also finding similar challenges. So I think that's one of the things that's driven it. Also, there's been a bit of a rush towards the end of the year, I think, for people wanting to get something bought, because in Australia, you do find through the second half of December, then through all the way through January, nothing really happens, and there's not much stock hitting the market then either. So I think there's been a bit of a rush towards the end of the year. Actually, the final quarter of 2023 will comfortably be the busiest we've ever had. So I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me that 15 months ago or so, but that is how it's played out. So yeah, there is stock on the market, but it's not always the best. It's often investors offloading. I think sometimes cash flow focused investors have looked at the way things stack up now. They're less keen than they were a year ago, and they're just offloading. And sometimes it's that, that sort of underperforming property that's being offloaded, like a high-rise apartment, or maybe something a bit less desirable, sort of B and C grade stuff. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed market, but overall, the quality stock on the market is pretty tight.
Yeah. I'll just quickly run through some of the data. This is to the end of November. So we obviously recording this in December, so we don't have the December data yet from CoreLogic, but Sydney year over year, 10% up, Melbourne 3%, Brisbane and Gold Coast 10%, Adelaide 7.5 or 7.6, Perth 13.5. So that capital city aggregate is 8.6 overall. We've got Darwin slightly lower, Canberra flat, and Hobart down 3%. Obviously, these indices and the way we measure it is, I guess, nuanced. So just keep that in mind. But I guess it just gives the people a spread of, we're seeing those capital cities still perform really strongly.
Overall, yes, especially for, Perth, I think as well. It's been a long time between drinks for WA, but its population growth is now running at over 3% year on year. So that's full on boom time population growth. That's really an echo of the resources construction boom years prior to 2011. So yeah, it's a long period where not much happened, but now it's really booming, and that's really right across Perth. Adelaide, I think the beachside or beachside adjacent suburbs have had a really good year. Brisbane in the mortgage belts, particularly some of those north side suburbs that we like, have been strong performers again. No real slowdown there. And yeah, there's other parts of the country, Newcastle, Central Coast. There's been a lot of activity there too. So yeah, I mean, I guess there would have been some of the tree change locations where things have come off a bit and softened, but not nearly as much as you might have expected. So a bit of a mixed bag. But as you said, Darwin kind of marches to its own drum a little bit, and Canberra's a bit flatter. But that's in context, coming off the back of some really strong years in the ACT.
I remember when we were in Port Macquarie, a lot of people were pretty optimistic and seeing, obviously that's an interesting market in itself, because you get a lot of slightly older people that are looking for that coastal change and still have all the amenities nearby up there in New South Wales. That was a market where seemed, at least at the time, quite resilient, and people's sentiment was upbeat. I remember being in Townsville, it was kind of mixed, obviously a bit further up and, kind of somewhat isolated in the city, but still people were quite optimistic. In terms of regional, Pete, I don't have the data in front of me, but in terms of regional areas, obviously 2021, leading into 2022, regional, suburbs, I'm thinking things that are outside the 2 or 3 major cities in your state, were quite, they were exceptional performers in some respects. I can't remember the latest data for 2023, but regional areas, have you got any working knowledge?
They have come off. I think if you looked at places like Gold Coast or even closer to home, Sunshine Coast, it was full on boom time for places like Noosa, in fact, all up and down the Sunshine Coast. Now, yeah, things have come off. The sort of the frenzy has gone out of the market. So I don't know what the official stats would show, but I imagine from the sort of the peak of the frenzy, things would be down 10% plus. But it's not like there's sort of raging bargains. And in fact, it seems sentiment maybe picking up again. But I think actually that was true probably of a lot of the regional markets where I think you find in some of the smaller markets, they're a bit less liquid, thinner markets. So it takes a smaller number of people to move the needle. And a lot of people obviously left the high density projects in Sydney and Melbourne because, well, why wouldn't you? You couldn't use the amenities, you couldn't use the lifts, you couldn't, it wasn't a great place to be for a couple of years. And a lot of people took that opportunity to make a sea change or a tree change. And it was a real sort of day in the sun for a lot of regional markets. Some of that would have reversed a little bit over the past year, but we're not seeing sort of a major crash in prices in particular. So you might have expected more fallout, really. Given we haven't had a hiking cycle like we've just seen in recent history.
I remember when we were in Wangaratta. Rental vacancy in Wangaratta, this is in regional Victoria for folks who aren't aware, very, very, very slim pickings in terms of what was on offer, even for purchasing. Like during COVID, it was so tight, unbelievably tight. But even when we were visited there this year in 2023, it was somewhat like that. People still really struggling to find properties in and around those regional hubs that have the hospitals and the regional train networks. It was just so hard to find those. And I think there has been a genuine shift in people's willingness to tolerate a commute or maybe work remotely and take a lower salary. I think kind of COVID did usher in that from what I've seen so far. Obviously, some of the companies this year are bringing people back to the offices, particularly I'm thinking of like the big banks and these types of businesses have really kind of pushed back on some of the previous, COVID flexible working arrangements. I guess it would be remiss of us if we do this episode at the end of the year, right, Pete, to not look forward a bit without maybe getting into the specifics in too much detail. Obviously, we don't want people to be like, Pete and Owen said that there was going to be a 10% rise in the Newcastle property market, so I've gone and bought a property. But, you spend a lot of time in the data at the macro level, but also at the micro level, dealing with individuals, with coaching and buyer's agency and so forth. We recently wrote a piece for our membership website. What are you looking at as we stare into 2024? What are the things that people that listen to the Australian Property Podcast should be paying attention to?
I think I'll just add to your point there. It was an absolute pleasure to get out to Wangaratta and Port Macquarie. Lovely places to live. And I think it's a good thing that we're starting to celebrate some of those regional markets a bit more. I loved our time. We actually stayed in Port Macquarie for a full week and the kids just had a great time. Beach every day. There's plenty going on in those.
That's amazing.
Those sorts of markets. I like warmer weather, but for people who are go for the more sort of temperate climate, it's just a super place to live. So lots of Sydney-siders there. Obviously, a lot of people have retired or semi-retired up that way. So long may that continue. So things to watch in 2024. So I'll give you three things. Firstly, the lending market. Will interest rates fall, and if so, when? It does look that way. I think if you look at global markets, expecting 6 cuts in the US, 6 cuts for the UK, I don't think Australia will get anything like that unless the shit really hits the fan, in which case, all bets are off. But I think we'll probably see some easing in interest rates in the second half of next year. The other thing to watch is whether APRA just releases that lending assessment buffer. That's really dampened borrowing capacity. But it kind of made sense when interest rates were zero to protect people from rising rates. But if you look at what bond markets are pricing, which is lower interest rates, it doesn't make sense to be penalising investors, first-time buyers with a 3 percentage points assessment buffer. So I guess I'll just keep an eye on that. So what happens to lending? And it should get a bit easier as the year goes on next year. On the second point, on the demand side, will we start to get new investors coming into the market? We know some investors are leaving. And I think, yes, because rents are still rising. And I think actually, the thing to watch in 2024, there'll be a bit of a battle between investors and first-time buyers. First-time buyers, it sucks to be a renter at the moment. So anyone who can afford to buy, whether that's through the bank of mum and dad or other means, first-time owners grants, I think all first-time buyers who can buy will be looking to do so next year. So there'll be a bit of a battle between investors coming back and first home buyers. So that's the second thing to watch. Thirdly, I think on the supply side, and bearing in mind we've got record population growth happening, I think we'll finally start to see a rebound in things like building approvals. We're just starting to see some of those build-to-rent projects coming out of the ground, particularly in Melbourne. We might just start to see things turn around. It's been a horror year for construction companies and developers. Loads of insolvencies, decade highs. Materials costs have jumped. The cost of delivering medium density projects is up 50% since pre-COVID levels. Wow. So it's a horrible time for developers. But I think we're probably through the worst, and we might just start to see, as the year goes on, an increase in construction again, an increase for building and in the housing market, and approvals getting up again, because the demand is there. We've got population growth running at extremely high levels. And will more people start to sell as well? Maybe yes. We'll probably get a bit more confidence. So maybe just a bit of an easing up of supply. But yeah, we've got a lot of work to be done there, because population growth is obviously running at red hot levels, and that's becoming a bit of a political issue, not just in Australia, but also for Canada, UK, US, New Zealand. A lot of people are a bit twitchy about just the sheer rate of population growth in a lot of these developed economies. Yeah.
It's definitely one of those things that you can see the kind of the capacity and the friction points that it's causing in the property market, probably most pronounced. And I'll just maybe add one more thing to this, which is something that I watch closely, which is just the household savings rate, which anyone can look at on the ABS website, or it comes out monthly. And you can just look at basically how households are tracking in terms of what they actually spend and what they're saving. And that has plummeted since COVID. And it's kind of like this idea of like almost like I don't study this to the scientific, to the decimal place, but what I do look at is basically the trend that we're seeing. And it basically is a reflection, in my opinion, of interest rate movements for the mortgage belt. And it doesn't look pretty, the trajectory it's currently on. And so eventually my sense is that things have to ease for those folks. And I'm one of those folks as well. And I think that point that you mentioned about APRA, I think, Pete, that's pretty important for a lot of people who go into that holding pattern that I mentioned earlier on, where they've reached out to a mortgage broker. They've kind of got to the point where the mortgage broker said, well, we can get you $700,000 or $600,000 based on X, Y, and Z, but your target is $900,000. So you're going to have to wait here or lower your expectations. A lot of them are just waiting until maybe some of that assessment buffer comes down, or rates come down, and then there's some sort of bank offering that can match that. So that would be for anyone listening that is in that position where you're looking to invest, you're looking to upgrade, you're looking to buy your first home. Just stay in that part of the market and be ready, keep looking, and speak to your mortgage broker about these developments, because they will be really important for you. But also take a look at some of those changes that are coming through in terms of incentives and grants and schemes. There's so many on offer at the moment, depending on your profession, depending on your savings, depending on your income potential. Have a look around and speak to your mortgage broker. Keep in contact with them. All right, so my final question then, Pete, is just as we wrap up a big year on the Australian Property Podcast. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in this year, who has shared the podcast with friends. I would say that we're now Australia's second biggest property show. So really, really happy with how things have gone so far. But I think the show and our community can 2 or 3x from here over the next couple of years. And we'll be on the road again this year. So come out and say hello if you do get the chance. The events are cheap, like $30 a ticket, and you get to chat with all of us. So we'd love to meet you in person. But my final one for you, Pete, is, so much uncertainty in 2022. Just headlines coming at everyone thick and fast in 2023. Is property still a valid long-term wealth creating vehicle, in your opinion?
Well, yes, long-term being the key word there. I actually think 2024 will be a positive year for property for the aforementioned reasons. I think 2023 has been hard with interest rates going up. And I think in 2024 the economy might slow down, but actually demand for housing is running a record high. So I think we're not really building enough, and that's not going to change for the next 3 years probably. So I think the fundamentals are strong. But yes, as you rightly pointed out, let's try not to be too myopic, because there's always going to be predictions about what's going to happen next month or next year. But generally, property works best as a long-term wealth creation vehicle. I think if you looked back, the data only goes back so far, but if you went back to 1970, you'd be paying about 19 grand for a house in Sydney and about 13 in Melbourne. So the long-term results, 8.5% compounding capital growth, have been very, very good. But there'll be ups and downs along the way. But you'll generally find, if you take a longer-term view, it just gets a bit easier to pull the trigger and make a decision.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. And for me, it's like two S's for me. I think about a lot: supply and serviceability. If you can service your loan, if you have the cash flow in your own budget and you're sensible with that, and you find a property that is in limited supply, or maybe as you or Chris would say, scarcity, if you find that combination, a lot of the noise can be tuned out, because you're going to be able to meet your commitments for that property, and you've got a good asset that's yours. And I think with those two things in mind, for me personally, not that I'm the expert in this conversation, but I'm just as optimistic about 2024 as I probably have been in the past. So be ready, folks. Be ready for a big year in terms of falling cash rates and interest rates. I think that just be ready, and fortune favors those who are prepared and go into that without things like a lot of credit card debt, without things like really poor savings habits. You want to have those sorted now, sort them out over Christmas and New Year's. Get on top of that now and be prepared, because the opportunities will arise. Pete, it's been a hell of a year. I love the Santa hat, mate. I do appreciate you cracking that out. You're the only other person that on any of the Rask podcasts has ever thought it'd be a good idea to get a Santa hat out. So I really do appreciate that, and all your contributions throughout the year. So I wish you all the best with the coaching and the buyer's agency in 2024, mate.
It's been a great year. Thanks. I've enjoyed every second. Cheers, Owen, and look forward to next year as well.